Settle yourself, if you haven't already. Let the world outside quiet itself down, as though the air itself were softening. Dim your lights, or blow out that candle if you like the shadows to dance in the corners. Let your blanket fall around you like a hush, a kind of fabric cocoon. If there's a pillow beneath your cheek, nudge into it a little more, as though you are making peace with the night. Tonight we'll drift into a story that sounds like something from a windswept Gothic novel. A Victorian lady, a lonely shore, and the improbable, yet somehow utterly plausible, marriage to a ghost sea captain. It's a tale of salt spray and lace gloves, of ballroom whispers and fog-thick nights. I'll tell it to you slowly, in long winding corridors of thought, so you can wander through without worrying about where you'll end up. And before we begin, I wonder, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there, in your own quiet corner? And if this calm journey helps you unwind, you might gently tap like or subscribe, only if it feels right. We're not here for hustle or hurry, just a quiet companionship in the dark. The photograph is always where I begin, because it has that kind of smudged certainty, black and white, edges curling like autumn leaves, the faint scent of attic dust if you imagine it close enough. She's there, seated stiffly on a carved chair, her dress a froth of cream and shadow. The bodice is high-necked, buttons precise as if lined up by a clockmaker. A tiny watch pendant hangs at her throat, and I wonder if it ticked, or if it was simply a prop for the sitting. Behind her, the painted backdrop is a seaside scene, cliffs reaching upward like the spines of old books. But the sea is the real one, the one she knew, grey and restless, always present in her story. She lived near the Cornish coast, they say, though some accounts place her in the Isle of Wight. You know how stories shift, like shingle underfoot when the tide pulls back. If you lean into the photo, her eyes meet yours, though meet is perhaps too direct a word. It's more like she's looking through you, the way people do when they're halfway between the room they're in and the memory they're replaying. I imagine the faint scratch of the photographer's instruction. Hold still, madam. Think of something pleasant. Pleasant to her might have been the first night she heard the tapping on the glass. The tapping was not the wind, though she told herself it was. Nor was it the neighbour boy playing tricks. No, this was a slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 beats, a pause, then 2. She counted them under the covers, like a lullaby written in Morse code. Outside, the sea was restless, as it always is in October, 1872 to be exact, the autumn when the storms came early. That date I can place with confidence, because the local paper recorded shipwreck that month, the Marionetta, a merchant vessel out of Bristol. I don't want you to picture the wreck too sharply. This isn't that sort of tale. Think of it instead as a shadow against the horizon, sails straining, wood groaning like an old man trying to rise from his chair. The captain, a man of middle years with eyes like the underside of storm clouds, did not make it ashore alive, or rather, not in the usual way. Now, you might be wondering how a Victorian lady of breeding could possibly meet a ghost sea captain without alarming the entire county. But remember, this was a time when séances were as fashionable as afternoon tea. People wrote letters to the dead with more enthusiasm than to their own cousins. Still, hers was not the parlour sort of ghost story. She did not gather friends to watch table legs twitch or hear a tambourine rattle in the dark. No, hers was solitary, private. And if you've ever kept a secret so long it becomes more like furniture than thought, always there yet never spoken of, you'll understand her inclination. The first time he appeared, it was not as a full figure. She saw only the sleeve of his coat, wet with brine, disappearing around the doorframe of her drawing room. The scent followed, a mix of salt, tobacco, and something like cedarwood, the sort of cologne a man might carry in a tin flask on long voyages. She told herself she was overtired. She'd been reading too much, perhaps, an indulgence in novels she hid under embroidery patterns. But that night she dreamed of him. Not in a romantic way, not yet. It was more like she'd stumbled upon a stranger sleeping in her own home, his head bowed, his hands folded as if in prayer or surrender. When she woke, the room smelled faintly of the sea. I'll pause here, not to build suspense, but because I can almost hear the rain outside your window now, and it's better to let the scene breathe. Imagine her rising from bed, the floorboards cool beneath her bare feet, the fireplace low but still warm enough to paint a dim glow on the wallpaper. She crosses to the window, pulls the lace curtain aside. There's the moon, and beyond it, a slice of dark horizon. Somewhere out there is the marionetta, or what's left of it, drifting under the surface like a forgotten thought. She would not speak to him, not properly, for several weeks. But she began to notice things. A chair moved slightly from where she'd left it, the faintest hum of a shanty she didn't know. Sometimes a trail of damp footprints on the flagstones of the back hall, though the door was bolted. Do you think she was afraid? I don't. She was curious, in the way one is curious about a lock trunk in the attic. You tell yourself you'll leave it alone, but your mind returns to it when you're buttering your toast or brushing your hair. By November, she began leaving a small glass of rum on the mantelpiece before bed. She'd heard sailors liked rum. In the morning, the glass would be empty and the air faintly warmer, as though someone had been standing close to the fire. That winter was long, and the wind seemed always to be testing the shutters. Yet inside she felt watched over, not in the way of a maid minding the silver, but like a lantern hung at the edge of a dock, guiding, constant, unblinking. And when the thaw came in March, she began to wonder if a lady could truly fall in love twice. Once with a living man, and once with a story that wore a man's shape. And as we close this first chapter, imagine the photograph once more. The lace gloves, the steady gaze, the hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. A smile that seems to say, yes, there was more to me than you guessed. It's a small thing, isn't it? Single glass of rum left overnight, no grand declaration, no flourish. Yet small things have a way of becoming habits, and habits become arrangements. I've always thought the human heart works a bit like a mantelpiece itself. There's only so much space for what you keep there. Some ornaments stay for years, gathering a film of familiarity, while others are placed there quietly and somehow never moved again. By the third week of her little offering ritual, she'd stopped thinking of it as unusual. She would place the glass, half full, never brimming, on the mantelpiece just after tending the fire for the evening. The act was not unlike winding a clock or drawing the curtains. It slipped into the cadence of her nights. Now, if you've ever lived by the sea, you'll know that salt air has its own brand of silence. It's not the same as a forest hush, nor the thick stillness of snow. This silence holds a faint hum, like a seashell held to the ear, but gentler, less insistent. That was the sound that wrapped around her as she moved about her drawing room each evening, smoothing the folds of her gown, glancing once toward the glass. The first night she noticed it missing entirely, she felt an odd pang. It was a Tuesday. She remembered because the fishmonger had been late, and she'd ended up eating bread and cheese for her supper instead of cod. She'd placed the rum in its usual spot, but in the morning the glass was still there, untouched. The rum sat heavy at the bottom, catching the morning light in a way that made it seem almost molten. She wondered if perhaps she'd offended him, though offended seemed too strong. Had she done something different? Forgotten some unspoken courtesy? There was no handbook for how to leave drinks for a spectral mariner after all. That day passed quietly. She busied herself with embroidery, making a sampler of small roses in pale thread. Outside, gulls wheeled over the cliffs, their cries sharp against the steady wash of the tide. By dusk, she had decided to try again. This time, she left a smaller measure, and beside it, a wedge of lemon sliced thin and neat. She'd read somewhere, perhaps in an old travelogue, that sailors took citrus against scurvy. The next morning the glass was empty once more, and the lemon gone. Not merely moved or discarded, the saucer she had placed it on was clean, with only the faintest sheen of dampness where the slice had been. If she had needed proof that this was no trick of her imagination, that might have been it. The thought made her smile into her teacup, a private sort of smile, the kind you give when you've been let in on a secret. She began to talk to him in small ways, not directly, never a full conversation, but comments dropped into the air as she moved about her home. "I wonder if it will rain tonight," she might say while buttoning her cuffs. Or, standing by the window, "The tide's in early, Captain." She never called him by any other name, for she did not know it yet. The days grew shorter. The lamps were lit earlier, and the drawing room took on that winter smell, lamp oil, hearth smoke, and the faint woolly scent of blankets taken from the chest. It was on one such evening that she heard him hum. It was not loud, not even entirely in tune, but it threaded through the air between her and the fire, with an ease that made her stop in her stitching. It was a tune she didn't know, slow, with a rise and fall that mimicked the roll of the sea. She sat very still, letting the needle pause mid-air until it faded, and when it did, she found she had been holding her breath. You might think she would be frightened, but instead she felt a peculiar comfort. Imagine being alone in a quiet house and hearing a kettle whistle. Not yours, not anywhere in your kitchen, but somehow you're certain it means tea will be ready soon. That's the kind of comfort it was. By Christmas, the glass of rum had become as much a part of her holiday traditions as the evergreen bough above the door. That year she kept her celebration small, just herself, a roast goose, and a plum pudding she was rather proud of. She left him a generous portion of both, on separate plates, with the rum in the middle like a peace offering between worlds. In the morning the plates were empty, and though the house was still, she could swear the air was warmer, the way it feels after someone has just left the room. From then on the sense of him became stronger, the faint creak of boots in the hall, the sigh of the floorboard near the window seat. Once she caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass, a dark coat, high collar turned up, and the glint of brass buttons catching the light. When she turned, the space was empty, but the scent of the sea lingered. She did not yet love him, not quite, but she'd stopped thinking of him as anything but a presence, as real to her as the postman or the charwoman. And perhaps, without noticing, she'd made space for him on the mantelpiece of her heart as well. And as we leave that quiet room for tonight, picture it as she saw it. The fire burning low, the glass on the mantelpiece empty, and just beyond the window, the restless sea whispering secrets only she could hear. It was on an afternoon in late January that she found it. Not because she'd gone looking, but because she'd been trying to tidy the sideboard. Dust had a way of finding every crevice, and she'd been in a mood to clear it away, as if a polished brass candlestick could make the winter feel less grey. Inside the bottom drawer was a ledger, not hers. The binding was stiff, the leather cracked like a dry riverbed. She almost put it aside, thinking it must have been left by the previous tenant, or perhaps tucked there by mistake years ago. But there was a faint scent to it, familiar now, unmistakable. Salt, cedar, a whisper of tobacco leaf. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat but firm, the kind of script that doesn't just list things but commands them. Dates, cargo tallies, ports of call, Bristol, Lisbon, Havana. Her eyes moved down the columns until they reached a final entry dated October 14th, 1872. Cleared port of Havana, cargo secure, weather fair, expecting rougher seas upon approach to English coast. God willing, we'll see Falmouth in a fortnight. And then a name. Captain Elias Harridge. She said it aloud, quietly, as though afraid it might shatter if spoken too loudly. Elias. The syllables rolled gently, heavier at the start, like a small wave breaking and pulling back again. Harridge, a name with edges sturdy as a dock post. That evening she placed the rum on the mantelpiece as usual, but this time she said the name. Just once, almost under her breath. There was no sound in reply, but the fire crackled brighter, as though a log had shifted in agreement. Over the next days she began using it when she spoke to him. "You'd like this wind, Elias," she might say, as she fastened her shawl before stepping into the garden, or looking at the sea through the spyglass her father had left her. "A squall coming in, Elias. Best keep the sails close." The name gave shape to her thoughts about him. It's strange, isn't it, how a name can do that? Before, he'd been a vague presence. Captain, or simply he. Now he was Elias Harridge, and it was easier to imagine the details, the set of his jaw, the way he might lace his fingers when listening. She even began to picture how he might have laughed. Not loudly, but with a quiet rumble like distant thunder over calm waters. One night she dreamed of the ship again. Only this time she stood on its deck. The air was cool, sharp with salt. Lantern light swung in the rigging, and she could hear the creak of wood beneath her feet. He was there, not close enough to touch, but watching her from the helm. His coat collar was turned up against the wind, and though the moon was bright, his features were just beyond clarity, as though seen through a pane of rippled glass. When she woke, she found something on the floor by her bed. It was a brass button, dull with age, stamped with an anchor design. She picked it up, holding it in her palm, and the scent of salt and cedar rose so strongly she had to close her eyes. From that night onward, the button stayed on the mantelpiece beside the glass of rum, a kind of anchor of its own, proof perhaps that this was more than fancy. The weeks that followed were marked by small exchanges. She would leave the glass. In the morning it would be empty. Sometimes she'd find the fire banked more neatly than she had left it, or the curtains drawn against a sudden squall she hadn't heard in the night. Once a sprig of dried lavender appeared on her writing desk. She had not grown lavender in years. Do you think she spoke of it to anyone? Of course not. The Victorians had an appetite for ghost stories, yes, but they also had a keen instinct for scandal. A lady living alone, receiving nightly visits from an unseen mariner, alive or not, would have been fodder for whispers that could cling like damp wool. Instead, she carried the story quietly, letting it unfold in the soft, private spaces of her home. There was no rush, no demand for it to be more than it was. In some ways, it was the opposite of the hurried courtships she'd seen among her peers. No dances, no chaperones, no exchange of calling cards, just a steady, unspoken presence, like the tide. One morning in early February, she noticed the ledger had been moved. Not by much, just an inch or two along the sideboard. But it was open to a page she had not seen before. A short note written in the same firm hand, but without a date. If you see this, know that the sea keeps what it loves, but sometimes it lets the wind carry a word ashore. She closed the book gently, her heart slower but somehow fuller, and that night when she placed the rum on the mantel, she whispered not just his name, but, "I hear you, Elias." And perhaps it was her imagination, but she thought she heard the faintest sound in return, a sigh, not weary but content, like a sailor stepping onto familiar docks after a long voyage. And now, as we step away from her quiet drawing room, let's leave the brass button on the mantel, the ledger in its drawer, and the sea whispering against the cliffs outside. The story is only just beginning, and the tide is still turning. It was the night of the late frost when she first saw the glow. Not the ordinary sort of lamplight. Too golden, too steady for that. This was a thinner, paler light, the kind you might see through the fog, wavering ever so slightly, as though it had sailed in from somewhere else entirely. She'd been sitting in the parlour mending the hem of her skirt, the fire low but still alive. The hour had grown quiet in that particular way when even the clock seems to hesitate between ticks. That's when it caught her eye, a shimmer of brightness spilling faintly from the hallway. At first she thought perhaps the lamp by the front door had been left lit, though she couldn't recall touching it that evening. She rose, setting her sewing aside, and stepped to the doorway. The light wasn't coming from any lamp she owned. It hovered a foot above the ground, moving slowly along the hall toward the kitchen, just enough to cast the faintest glint on the brass door latch. She followed barefoot, her steps silent on the worn runner. The air in the hall was cooler than the parlour, with that fresh tang of salt air that only crept inside on certain nights. As she walked, the glow seemed to notice her, not quickening or dimming, but swaying gently, as if acknowledging her presence. When it reached the end of the hall, the light paused, and for a moment she thought she saw the outline of a lantern frame, its glass flecked with salt. Inside it the flame bent and straightened, as if to some rhythm of a sea she could not hear from here. Then, without so much as a flicker, it faded, leaving only the dim shape of the door in front of her. She stood there a while, waiting, but the silence returned to its usual hum. It wasn't frightening, more like catching a glimpse of someone you know in a crowd and having them disappear before you can wave. The next morning, she noticed something on the hall table. It was her father's old compass, one she hadn't seen in years, its brass dulled, the needle still steady. She was sure it had been packed away in a drawer upstairs. Lifting it, she found it faintly warm to the touch, as though someone had been holding it. That day the wind picked up, bringing gulls inland. Their cries sounded strange against the muted grey sky, and the sea seemed restless beneath the cliff. When she placed the rum on the mantel that night, she set the compass beside it. "You've been out walking, Elias," she murmured. She did not expect a reply, but a few moments later the compass needle began to twitch, slow at first, then in a steady swing before settling firmly north. There was a comfort in this sort of exchange, even if it bent the edges of the ordinary. She began to imagine that his nightly movements through the house were like the pacing of a watch on deck, measured, purposeful. The lantern light in the hall might have been his way of tracing the boundaries, keeping them safe. Sometimes, when she sat in her chair in the parlour with her sewing or a book, she would hear the faint jingle of what could only be a keyring, as though he were checking each lock. And she liked to think of him that way, not merely as a phantom bound to the place, but as a captain still, keeping to his duty. One rainy evening she took the liberty of speaking more plainly. "I imagine you've had worse seas than this," she said aloud, as the wind rattled the shutters. The fire popped in response, but more than that, there was a distinct sound from the hallway. 2 slow steps, the kind that make the wood groan softly under the weight. When she looked, there was nothing, but the faintest smell of wet rope drifted in. She thought of the coil of it that might have been looped at his shoulder in life, ready for a sudden change in weather. It is a strange thing to become accustomed to what others might find impossible. She began to sleep with her bedroom door open, trusting the quiet creak of those steps. If she woke in the night, she might catch a glimmer of pale light in the distance, moving with patient ease. Spring crept in slowly that year, as if reluctant to disturb whatever arrangement the winter had sealed. On the first truly mild night, she opened the window in the parlour and sat listening to the sea, the rum glass untouched beside her. She didn't hear him come in, if coming in was the right term, but she felt the shift in the room, that subtle weight of being watched over, the same as the lantern light in the hall. Without turning, she said, "I hope you'll stay a while, Elias." And though no words came back, the flame in the lamp on the mantel swayed gently, as though in agreement before righting itself. Now, as we leave her to that quiet evening, picture the hall again, the pale light fading at the far end, the compass resting steady, and the sea beyond keeping its slow, eternal watch. March arrived with the kind of weather that doesn't so much sweep in as it seeps, damp in the walls, damp in the seams of your boots, damp in the very air you breathe. The first few days passed in a steady drizzle, but then the wind shifted, and the sea began to stir itself into something wilder. She could feel it before she could hear it. The house seemed to hold its breath as though bracing. Even the small mirror in the hallway trembled slightly on its nail, and she thought for a moment it might be her imagination until she felt the draught along the baseboards. By the third evening, the rain had grown into a true downpour, striking the windows so hard that beads of water ran down the inside of the glass. Somewhere in the rafters, something groaned, a beam settling, or perhaps protesting. The fire hissed when the wind pressed down the chimney. She sat close to the hearth, a shawl over her shoulders, and told herself the storm would pass. Yet beneath the roar of the wind and the crash of the waves, she thought she could make out another sound, the faint rhythmic creak of a ship at sea. It came in intervals, just enough to catch her ear before the wind swallowed it again. The rum glass on the mantel was empty earlier than usual that night, though she had only placed it there an hour before. She wondered if Elias had taken it in haste, if, in his own realm, the weather was as fierce as it was here. Then came the knock. 3 slow raps against the front door, spaced far apart like the measured beat of a ship's bell in fog. She froze, listening. Another set of knocks, the same rhythm. No one in their right mind would be calling at her door in such weather. But she rose, shawl clutched tighter, and went to the door. When she opened it, the porch was empty. The wind rushed past her, carrying the scent of brine so strong it made her eyes sting. There was no figure, no lantern, only the dark outline of the garden gate swinging in the gusts. She closed the door and turned the bolt, but the scent lingered. That night she dreamed of standing on the deck of the Marionetta again, the rain stinging her face, the sails straining against the wind. Elias was there, close this time, his coat soaked, hair plastered to his brow. He said something, she couldn't make out the words, but his eyes were fixed on hers with such urgency she woke with her heart racing. Morning brought no calm. The storm had worsened, and the path to the garden was a small river of mud. She lit every lamp in the house, though the grey light outside never brightened. When she passed the mantel, she saw the compass from the hall table had been moved, its lid open, the needle spinning in small feverish circles. She sat with it, holding it in her palm until the spinning slowed and the needle settled north again. "I'm here," she whispered, unsure if she was reassuring him or herself. That night she left not just rum but a folded blanket on the chair by the fire. In the morning the blanket was draped neatly over the armrest, still faintly warm. The storm finally began to ease on the fourth day, the wind losing its teeth, the rain softening into a steady patter. She stood at the window and watched the sea, still rough but no longer violent, rolling like a creature settling back into sleep. Somewhere out there, she thought, was the place where his ship had gone under. She traced the horizon with her eyes and wondered if he still kept a watch there, even in death. That evening she found a small object on the hall table, a chip of driftwood, smooth and pale, carved with the shape of an anchor. She held it in her hand and felt the faintest pulse of warmth, the kind you might feel from a stone that's been sitting in the sun. For the first time, she let herself say the words aloud. "I missed you in the storm." The fire crackled as though in reply, and the compass on the mantel gave one slow turn before resting again. And as we leave her there, the air still damp but the world quieter, picture the firelight playing over her face, the carved anchor in her hand, and the sea breathing its slow, endless rhythm beyond the window. The storm left the air smelling cleaner, almost metallic, like a silver spoon left to dry on a cloth. The sea was calmer now, though not entirely still. Its surface rippled in long, thoughtful swells, as though it too were recovering from the days of unrest. She took to opening the parlour window in the mornings, letting in the faint hiss of the tide and the sharper cries of the gulls. The house felt different now, settled yet carrying a sort of hum beneath the quiet, like the resonance after a bell has been struck. One morning, she decided to do something she hadn't tried before. Instead of rum, she poured tea. Strong black tea, still steaming, with a splash of milk. She set it on the mantel beside the brass button and the compass. "It's a fine morning for tea, Elias," she said, her voice lighter than it had been in days. When she returned to the room an hour later, the tea was gone. Not just sipped at. It was as though the cup had never been filled. But the strangest thing was the scent that lingered. Not just the faint salt and cedar she'd come to expect, but a richer aroma, like tea leaves steeped in sun-warmed wood. She began to alternate now, rum on some nights, tea on others. It became a quiet game, wondering which he might prefer. Sometimes she would add a small sweet, a sugared biscuit or a square of gingerbread, just to see if it would vanish too. More often than not, it did. The ledger in the sideboard remained closed these days, as though it had told her all it meant to for the moment. Still, she found herself running her fingertips over its cover whenever she passed, as though greeting it. The button remained in its place, its dull brass catching light in the evenings. The compass had not spun since the storm, its steadiness a kind of comfort. She began to notice something new, though. Not a sound, not a scent, but a feeling. When she was in the kitchen preparing her own tea, she would sense a presence in the doorway, not watching in a way that pressed on her, but simply there. If she turned her head too quickly, there was nothing, but if she kept to her work, she could feel him as surely as she felt the heat of the kettle. One afternoon, she heard the faint clink of china in the parlour. When she stepped in, the tea set she'd left on the low table had been arranged differently. The cups aligned, the teapot lid lifted just slightly, as though inspected. It made her laugh, a small sound that felt good in her chest. "You're a particular guest," she said aloud. March rolled toward April, and with it came a new softness to the days. She began to take walks along the cliff path again, her shawl pulled tight against the breeze. More than once she found a shell or small stone in her pocket afterward, something she was certain she hadn't put there herself. They were always smoothed by the sea, always faintly warm, as if recently held. One evening she left the tea and a small note beside it. Do you remember the storm? In the morning the tea was gone and the note had been moved, not taken, not altered, just shifted slightly, as though it had been read and set down again. She kept it in the ledger after that, pressed between 2 pages. Her days fell into a rhythm that was part her own, part shared. She found herself speaking aloud more often, not for her own benefit, but in case he was listening. I saw a fishing boat with a blue sail today, she might say, or the tide was high enough to reach the bottom of the cliff path. Each time there was some small acknowledgement, a faint shift in the firelight, the whisper of a draught where there was no open window. She began to feel that they were keeping each other's company, each in their own way. One night, as she was settling into her chair, she thought she saw him reflected in the glass of the cabinet. Just the faintest outline, a coat, a broad shoulder, the suggestion of a face turned toward her. It was gone before she could turn her head, but it left behind the deep certainty that he'd been closer than before. That night she slept with the window open a crack, the sound of the sea folding into her dreams. Somewhere in that half-sleep, she thought she felt a hand, warm, steady, rest briefly over hers. And when she woke, the teacup was back on the mantel, clean, dry, and placed just so. As we step away from her house tonight, picture the mantel as it is now, teacup in place, compass steady, button gleaming faintly, and the invisible thread of presence that binds her evenings to his unseen watch. It was on the first truly warm morning of April that she found it. Sunlight spilled across her bedroom in long stripes through the shutters, painting the quilt in a pattern that looked almost like the reflection of waves. She stirred slowly, savouring the rare warmth, and that's when she noticed something at the edge of her pillow. It was a shell, not large but perfectly shaped, its ridges fine and even as stitching. The colour was a soft blush, like the inside of a seashell dipped briefly in rosewater. She lifted it and felt, to her surprise, that it was faintly warm. The strangeness of it was not the shell itself. She'd seen many along the shore, but the fact that she hadn't left her window open the night before, and there was no sand anywhere in the room. She turned it in her hand, tracing the spiral, and for the briefest moment, she thought she heard the sea inside. Not the ordinary rush you hear when pressing a shell to your ear, but a low, steady hum, like the sound of a ship's hull cutting through water. At breakfast she placed the shell on the mantel, beside the brass button and the compass. It looked oddly fitting there, as though it had been meant to join them. "Thank you, Elias," she said quietly, and in reply the fire gave a single soft pop. The day passed in pleasant calm. She tended to her small garden, trimming back the rosemary and lavender, and even dared to plant a row of sweet peas along the fence. The sky held that clear blue that comes only a handful of times each spring, bright yet soft, with the kind of light that makes you think of new beginnings. That evening she brewed tea and cut a slice of seed cake to place beside it. She lingered in the parlour longer than usual, half expecting to see the lantern light again in the hallway. But the house remained quiet, save for the occasional shift of the fire. When she retired to bed, she found the shell had been moved, still on the mantel but closer to the compass, as though it belonged there. It was such a small thing, and yet it made her heart feel oddly full. Over the next week, other small gifts appeared. A sprig of sea heather, pale and delicate, placed neatly on the windowsill. A small round stone worn almost flat left on her writing desk. Once, a length of knotted cord, the kind sailors used for practice, looped into a perfect figure eight. She kept them all, arranging them on the mantel until it began to resemble a little shrine. Not of mourning, but of connection. Each object seemed to carry a trace of warmth, as if it had been passed from one hand to another before reaching her. It was around this time that she began to speak to him more directly. Not just comments into the air, but questions, small ones, without expectation of an answer. "Was it cold that night?" she asked once, standing at the window, looking out to sea. Another time, did you ever wish to sail somewhere far from here? Sometimes, the room would feel different after such questions, more still, as if the air itself were listening. Other times, the faint scent of cedar would deepen, lingering longer before fading. One evening, she asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Why me, Elias?" The words came out softer than she intended, almost a whisper. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the hallway she heard 2 slow footsteps. That was all. And yet it was enough for her to feel that he had, in some way, answered, if not with reason, then with presence. April deepened, and with it her sense that they were moving towards something. She didn't name it, not even to herself, but the quiet moments felt heavier now, as though the air between them was growing more tangible. Sometimes she thought she might even feel the faintest shift of the floorboards near her chair, the weight of someone standing close. The night before May Day, she found another shell on her pillow. This one was darker, almost the colour of the evening sky before rain. She placed it beside the first on the mantel, and for a moment she thought she saw the compass needle twitch. Not frantically, as in the storm, but with a slow, deliberate movement, as if acknowledging the gift. And as we leave her there tonight, picture the mantle in the firelight. 2 shells resting side by side, the compass steady, the brass button catching the glow, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the sea lingering in the room. May Day dawned with a softness that felt almost like apology for the March storms. The air was warm without heaviness, carrying the scent of new grass and something faintly sweet from the hedgerows. She woke early, the light spilling through her curtains in that way that makes you think the day is already well underway. She dressed without hurry, choosing a gown the colour of cream rather than her usual darker tones, and tied a ribbon at her waist. It wasn't for anyone in particular, but perhaps for the day itself, or perhaps for the way the sea looked when the sun first touched it. When she stepped into the parlour, she noticed the teacup she had left the night before was empty, as usual. But beside it was something new, a length of thin rope, about 1 foot long, tied into a neat sailor's knot. The knot was intricate, each loop lying flat and true, the ends tucked in as though finished by a practised hand. She turned it over in her fingers, the texture rough but familiar from the other bits of rope she'd been given. This one felt more deliberate, more purposeful. She placed it on the mantel beside the shells, the compass, and the brass button. The collection was beginning to look less like a scattered set of trinkets, and more like a message in objects, though if there was a pattern, she hadn't yet deciphered it. That morning, she walked the cliff path, the breeze tugging at her hair and skirts. From up there, the sea stretched endlessly, a quilt of silver and blue patched with white caps. She imagined Elias at the helm of his ship scanning that same horizon, reading the weather in the shape of the clouds. Near the edge of the path, she paused to watch the waves break against the rocks below. The rhythm was slow, almost hypnotic. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that quiet she could have sworn she heard humming again, the same low tune she'd caught once before, rising and falling like the swell of the water. Back home, she brewed fresh tea and set it beside a small plate of currant buns. She lingered in the room afterward, feigning interest in her needlework but really watching the mantle out of the corner of her eye. Nothing happened while she was there, but when she returned from fetching more wood for the fire, the tea was gone and 1 bun was missing from the plate. She smiled at that, a real, unguarded smile that lingered long after. As evening fell, the breeze that had been so light in the morning grew cooler, curling through the cracks in the shutters. She settled into her chair with a book she had been meaning to finish, though she read the same sentence several times without really absorbing it. The house had a way of pulling her attention toward the subtle rather than the obvious, the shift of light on the walls, the faint creak of a floorboard, the smell of the sea drifting in uninvited. It was then that she saw it, the pale glow of a lantern in the hall again. This time, it didn't drift away immediately. It stayed near the doorway to the parlour, casting a soft halo that made the brass latch gleam. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as the glow swayed slightly, as though held by a hand. After a long moment, it faded, but the warmth it left behind seemed to stay in the room, settling into the corners like dust in sunlight. Before retiring that night, she touched each object on the mantel in turn: the shells, the compass, the rope, the button. It had become a habit, almost like bidding someone good night. As her fingers lingered on the rope, she thought she felt the faintest vibration, as though it had just been tied. When she finally lay down, the Mayday breeze slipped in through the slightly open window, carrying the faint tang of salt. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if the rope was meant as an invitation or a warning. But that thought faded as she drifted towards sleep, replaced by the hum of the sea and the distant, steady rhythm of a captain on watch. And as we leave her there, picture the open window, the fire burning low, the lantern glow still clinging faintly to the hall, and the quiet promise of warmer days ahead. It was a week after May Day when she found the map. She'd been looking for a spool of thread in the bottom drawer of the escritoire, a piece of furniture that seemed to collect oddments as a beach collects shells, when her fingers brushed paper that felt older than the rest. She pulled it out carefully. It was folded into neat squares, the edges frayed just enough to suggest years of handling. The paper was thick, almost cloth-like, and it had that faintly smoky scent of things kept near a lamp or hearth for too long. When she opened it, the map seemed to breathe. It wasn't a map of the county or of England at all. It was the Atlantic. Lines of longitude and latitude, ports marked in careful ink. Bristol, Lisbon, Havana. And there, in the lower right, a line of script in the same hand as the ledger, E. Harridge Master. She spread it across the escritoire, tracing the route marked in dotted ink. It began in Bristol, curved down the coast of Spain, across to the Caribbean, then back again. She could almost picture the voyage, the heat of the sun in the tropics, the sudden coolness as the ship neared home waters. There was one more thing, a small X, marked just off the Cornish coast, not far from where she lived. No date, no note, just that solitary mark. She rested her finger there, feeling the faint roughness of the ink. That night she placed the map on the mantel, carefully folded so the X was visible. "I found this in the escritoire, Elias," she said, as though mentioning it over tea. "I wonder if it was the last voyage." The following morning the map was still there, but the X had been circled in fresh ink. She ran her fingertip over it. The ink was dry, but not cracked. It felt as though it had been made in the night. She began to keep the map on the low table in the parlour, sometimes unfolding it just to look at that route. In the quiet of the evening, she would imagine herself on that ship, standing beside him at the rail, the salt air catching in her hair. The next few days brought more signs. A small square of sailcloth, left folded on her writing desk. A bit of charcoal, smudging her fingertips as she lifted it. Once a length of narrow ribbon appeared, woven with a faded pattern of anchors. It felt like a trail, each object leading her towards something she couldn't yet name. One evening she brewed tea as usual, but set it beside the unfolded map instead of the mantel. When she returned later, the tea was gone, and the map had been folded back neatly, almost exactly as she had found it in the drawer. Almost, but not quite. Now, a faint line of ink extended from the X, pointing toward the shore nearest her house. She considered that line for a long time. Was it a place he wanted her to go? A warning? Or simply a memory he wished to share? The question stayed with her into the night, winding through her thoughts like a tide that refuses to ebb. She didn't decide immediately. Instead, she placed the map back on the mantel, folded so the X and the new line showed clearly. It became another piece in her growing arrangement, part keepsake, part puzzle. That week she took to walking the cliff path more often, eyes drawn to the spot on the horizon that matched the map. The sea there always seemed a little rougher, a little darker, even on calm days. And sometimes, when she paused to watch, she thought she saw a pale light, like a lantern, bob once before vanishing into the waves. She never saw it twice in the same place, but the thought of it lingered like the last notes of a song. And as we leave her for tonight, imagine the map spread in the firelight, the inked route curling across the ocean, and that small insistent X waiting just offshore, holding its quiet place in the story. It took her 3 days to make up her mind. 3 mornings of glancing at the map on the mantel, tracing the ink line from the X toward the coast. 3 afternoons of walking the cliff path and stopping at the place where the land leaned out just far enough to give a clear view of the shore below. The descent wasn't easy. The path was narrow in places, half swallowed by gorse and brambles, and she had to lift her skirts higher than was proper to step around the slick stones. The air grew cooler as she went down, the sea breeze damp against her cheeks. When she reached the bottom, the tide was half out, revealing a narrow strip of sand scattered with kelp and driftwood. She stood there a moment, the cliffs rising behind her, the sea ahead in slow, heavy swells. It was quiet in a way the cliff top never was. Down here, the sound of the wind was muffled, replaced by the steady hiss of water, drawing back over pebbles. She walked slowly along the shoreline, scanning the sand without knowing exactly what she was looking for. Near a flat rock mottled with lichen, she saw it. A lantern, or what remained of one. The metal frame was tarnished almost black. The glass cracked in places, but the handle was still intact. When she lifted it, she expected it to be cold, but it was faintly warm, as though it had been sitting near a fire. She carried it back to the house, setting it on the table in the parlour. "Is this what you wanted me to find, Elias?" she asked aloud. The fire gave a soft sigh, and somewhere in the hall a floorboard creaked. That evening, she placed the lantern on the mantel beside the map. It looked at home there, the cracked glass catching the light in fractured little sparks. She lit the fire early, the glow dancing over the objects in a way that made them seem almost alive. For the next few nights, the lantern stayed dark. Then, on the 4th evening, she came into the parlour to find it faintly glowing. Not the warm yellow of a candle, but a pale, silvery light, steady and calm. She stood watching it for a long time, the rest of the room dim, the fire just embers. She didn't touch it. Somehow she knew it wasn't meant to be moved once lit. Instead, she settled into her chair and read by its glow. The light was gentle on the eyes, bright enough to see the page, but not so strong that it banished the shadows. When she woke the next morning, having dozed off in the chair, the lantern was dark again, but the room was faintly warmer than it should have been. The teacup she'd left was empty, and the map had been folded neatly, the X now marked with a tiny dot of red ink. She began to think of the shore below the cliff as his place. When she walked there again, a week later, she left a small gift of her own, a length of ribbon tied to the handle of the old lantern's twin that hung by her door. It felt right to leave something behind, as though the exchange should go both ways. By June, the air had turned heavy with the promise of summer, and the sea was a softer colour, the steel grey giving way to a more forgiving blue. Yet each time she looked toward that stretch of coast, she thought of the lantern's pale light, and the way it seemed to hold something just out of reach. And as we leave her tonight, picture her sitting by the glow of that cracked glass lantern, the fire low, the sea beyond the cliff breathing its patient rhythm, and the map folded neatly, still holding its secrets. The red mark on the map stayed in her thoughts for days. It was so small, just a pinprick of colour, but it seemed deliberate, almost urgent. Each time she passed the mantel, her eyes went to it first, before the compass, the shells, even the glowing lantern. One morning, while watering the sweet peas along the garden fence, she found something strange. Caught on the wire trellis was a piece of red thread, fine but strong, knotted at one end. She untangled it carefully, the fibres catching faintly on her fingertips. Inside, she laid it on the table beside the map. The colour was the same as the mark. Deep, not garish, like the red of sealing wax. She could almost imagine it had been pulled straight from the ink itself. That evening, she placed the thread on the mantel, coiling it loosely beside the shells. "If you've more to tell me, Elias," she said softly, "you'll have to give me more than a line on a map." When she returned from the kitchen later, the thread had been tied into a sailor's knot. Not unlike the rope he'd left her before, but finer, more intricate. She ran her fingers over the loops, marvelling at the precision. Over the next week, she began to notice the thread in other places. Once, a short length of it was looped around the handle of her teacup in the morning. Another time, it was wound neatly around the brass button, almost like a cuff. Each time it seemed to draw her back to the map, to that small red mark by the coast. The weather turned warmer, the kind of warmth that makes the sea smell sweeter, less sharp. She began to take her tea in the garden in the mornings, the sun slanting through the rosemary bushes. More than once she thought she caught the sound of boots on the path behind her, slow, deliberate steps that stopped when she turned. One afternoon she took the map from the mantel and traced the line from the X to the shore, then from the shore inland toward where her house would be. It wasn't far at all. In fact, she realised the red mark was almost directly beneath the cliff where she'd found the lantern. That night she left both tea and rum on the mantel, a kind of offering for answers. The next morning the tea was gone, the rum half finished, and the map had been marked again. This time, a faint line of red thread had been pressed into the paper itself, glued somehow to follow the route to the shore. She didn't know whether to be unnerved or comforted. In the end, she decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was leading somewhere. By midsummer, she had the beginnings of a plan. She would go to the shore again, not just to wander, but to search. The thought filled her with a mix of anticipation and calm, as though some part of her had been waiting for this all along. That night she dreamt of walking the tide line with the red thread in her hand, trailing it along the sand. Somewhere in the dream, the thread grew taut, pulling her gently forward until she stood before something half buried in the sand. She woke before she could see what it was, the morning light spilling across the quilt like a slow tide. And as we leave her here tonight, picture the mantle with its growing collection, the shells, the compass, the button, the lantern, and now the coil of red thread, each piece holding its place like coordinates on a map only she and Elias could read. She waited for the right morning, not too windy, not too warm, the kind of day when the sea seems to lean back just far enough to show you what it's been keeping. The almanac had promised a particularly low tide, and she took that as a sign. She left early, the air still holding the coolness of dawn. The cliff path was damp with dew, the gorse heavy with yellow blooms that brushed her sleeves as she passed. The sea below was a paler blue than usual, almost translucent near the shore. When she reached the bottom, she paused to listen. The tide was pulling back, leaving wet sand glistening like polished stone. Seaweed lay in tangled ribbons, and here and there, pools of water shimmered with darting silver fish. She began at the rock where she'd found the lantern, scanning the ground slowly. The shells near the waterline were smaller here, finer, as if they'd been worn smooth by longer journeys. Bits of driftwood lay scattered, some pale and splintered, some dark and heavy with age. It wasn't until she reached a curve in the shore that she saw it, a coil of red thread, half buried in the sand. The tide must have only just uncovered it. It was still damp, clinging together in a twist. She knelt, brushing the sand away, and found that one end of the thread was looped through a small brass key. The key was tarnished, but the shape of the teeth was still sharp, precise. She turned it in her palm, the cold metal slowly warming in her hand. The red thread trailed from it like a marker on a chart. She carried it back up the cliff, her fingers curled tightly around it. By the time she reached the house, the sun was higher, spilling light across the parlour floor. She set the key on the mantel beside the map, the thread still tied through its ring. That evening she spoke to him more directly than she ever had before. "You've given me a key, Elias. What does it open?" The room stayed still, the fire quiet. She waited, half hoping for the creak of a floorboard, the shift of a shadow. The answer came later. Just before she went to bed, she passed the sideboard where the ledger was kept, and noticed the drawer was slightly open. Inside, the ledger lay as usual, but beneath it was a small brass lockbox she'd never seen before. The key fit perfectly. She didn't open it then, though. She placed it back on the mantel, telling herself that some things should be done in the light of day. That night she dreamed of a cabin, wood-panelled with a small desk and a single porthole. On the desk was the lockbox, open, the contents just hidden by shadow. Outside the porthole the sea glowed faintly, as if lit from beneath. When she woke, the air in the room smelled faintly of cedar and salt again, stronger than it had in weeks. The key still lay on the mantel, but the thread had been unwound from it, and now rested in a neat coil beside the shelves. She decided she would open the box that afternoon, when the light was bright and the tide was at its farthest reach. And as we leave her here, picture the key gleaming faintly in the sunlight, the map still marked with its small red X, and the low, steady hum of the sea beyond the window, as though waiting for her to take the next step. The afternoon light was steady when she finally set the lockbox on the table. She'd drawn the curtains just enough to soften the brightness, letting the room feel private without slipping into shadow. The box was heavier than she expected, the brass cool under her fingertips. She turned the key slowly. It moved without resistance, as though it had been waiting for years to be turned again. The latch gave a soft click, so small it might have been mistaken for the settling of the wood. Inside there were only 3 things. The first was a folded piece of parchment, its edges browned, the creases worn thin. She didn't unfold it yet. Instead, she set it carefully aside. The second was a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. When she loosened the string, she found a piece of cloth inside, navy blue, embroidered in one corner with the initials EH in white thread. It looked as though it had once been part of a uniform, perhaps a handkerchief or the corner of a flag. The fabric smelled faintly of tobacco and salt, even after all these years. The third was the smallest, a silver coin worn smooth on one side. On the other, the engraving was still clear enough, a crest, flanked by 2 anchors. She turned it in her palm, feeling the faint indentations under her fingertips. She sat there a while, the 3 objects before her, each carrying its own weight. It felt almost like an introduction, the way you might present tokens of yourself to someone you wanted to trust. When she finally opened the parchment, she found it wasn't a letter exactly, but a list. Dates, each one followed by a short note. June 14th, fair wind, full cargo. July 3rd, gale off Madeira, lost 2 sails. September 9th, land sighted Havana. October 12th. Weather turning, crew uneasy. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1872. The same as the ledger's final page. Heavy seas, lantern lit on deck. God keep us. She traced the last line slowly. It wasn't a farewell, not exactly, but it held the finality of one. That evening she set the 3 objects on the mantel, careful to arrange them with the others. The cloth beside the shelves, the coin next to the compass, the folded parchment beneath the lantern. The key she placed in the centre, as though it had earned its place. She didn't expect a response, but as she settled into her chair, the lantern began to glow. Not bright, just a soft, steady light that made the brass of the compass gleam and the shells shine faintly. She watched it for a long time, her tea cooling on the table beside her. Later, as she banked the fire for the night, she thought she heard something low and distant, the sound of rigging shifting in the wind, ropes tightening. It might have been the sea outside. It might not. When she went to bed, the lockbox sat empty on the table. She thought of putting it away, but decided to leave it there, as though ready to be filled again. And as we leave her for now, picture that mantle, the tokens lined in quiet order, the lantern's glow holding steady, and the map above them all, its small red X no longer just a mark on paper, but the beginning of something taking shape. The days grew warmer still, the air heavy with that midsummer stillness when even the gulls seemed reluctant to move. She kept the windows open late into the evening now, the scent of the sea mingling with the faint spice of the sweet peas blooming along the fence. The tokens from the lockbox had settled into their places on the mantel, as though they had always belonged there. She found herself glancing at them while reading, as if checking to be sure they were still keeping their quiet watch. It was on a still, moonlit night that she noticed something different. She'd gone to fetch more tea from the kitchen when she saw it, the faint glow of a lantern in the hallway again. But this time, there were 2 lights. One was the familiar pale glow she'd seen before, moving with that slow, steady sway. The other was smaller, warmer, like the light of a candle caught in glass. They moved together, side by side, toward the parlour. She stood in the doorway watching as the glow entered the room. The second light seemed to hover near the mantel, brushing over the map, the shells, the compass, as though inspecting them. The pale light lingered near her chair, steady and calm. For a long moment she felt suspended, caught between the world she knew and something else entirely. The smaller light bobbed once, then drifted toward the lockbox on the table. It hovered there before slowly fading, leaving only the pale lantern glow behind. She crossed to the box, half expecting to find something new inside. But it was empty. Instead, the faint scent of salt and cedar seemed to deepen, wrapping around her like a shawl. The pale light moved toward the window then, pausing just long enough for her to feel the shift in the air, a subtle drop in temperature, the way it feels when a cloud passes over the sun. Then it too faded, leaving only the steady crackle of the fire. That night she dreamed of the deck of the Marionetta again, but this time she was not alone with Elias. Another figure stood at the rail, smaller, face obscured by the shadow of a hood. The two lanterns hung side by side on the rigging, their light swaying gently over the wet planks. When she woke, the shelves on the mantel had been rearranged, two together on one side as though paired. The rope knot lay between them like a line drawn in the sand. She left both tea and rum that morning without comment. The tea was gone within the hour. The rum lingered until evening, as though whoever came for it had been busy elsewhere. It made her wonder if Elias had not been entirely alone on that last voyage. If perhaps there was another story intertwined with his, another presence that moved between her rooms in the quiet hours. By late afternoon, the sea mist had rolled in thick and low, muffling the usual sounds of the village. She sat by the window, watching the fog wrap itself around the garden gate, and thought of those two lights moving together in the dark. And as we leave her here, imagine the room as it is now, fire burning low, the tokens in their careful arrangement, and in the corners of the air, the memory of twin lanterns swaying gently in some unseen breeze. The fog stayed for 2 days, thick enough that the world beyond the garden felt like it had been folded away. Even the sound of the sea seemed muted, as though it were keeping its voice low. She kept the lamps lit longer than usual, their warm circles of light pushing gently against the grey at the windows. The house felt smaller in the fog, every room more intimate, more enclosed. On the second evening, as she was stirring a pot of soup in the kitchen, she heard it. 3 slow knocks at the back door. The rhythm was unfamiliar, not like the measured rap she had heard during the March storm. She set down the spoon and moved toward the door. The fog outside was so dense she could see only the faint outline of the shed. There was no one in sight, but when she looked down she saw it. A small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a length of the same red thread as before. She brought it inside, untying the thread with care. Inside the oilcloth was a single glove, leather, worn smooth, the stitching still tight. It was larger than her own, clearly a man's, and faintly smelled of salt and something metallic, like the tang of old coins. She placed it on the mantel beside the brass button, thinking how naturally it seemed to belong there. "Is this yours, Elias?" she asked aloud, her voice quieter than she intended. The fog pressed against the windows, unmoving, but the lantern on the mantel began to glow faintly, its cracked glass catching the light in fractured patterns. Later that night, as she sat reading in her chair, the glow deepened for just a moment, and in that brief flare she thought she saw a shape in the hallway. Not the full figure she'd once glimpsed in the glass, but something taller, broader, with the faint outline of a coat collar turned up against the chill. The shape lingered only a second before fading into the fog that seemed to seep through the very walls. She did not rise to follow. Instead, she closed her book and sat quietly, listening to the faint creak of floorboards in the distance. When she went to bed, she left the window slightly open. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the faintest sound of gulls somewhere beyond the fog. She dreamed of walking along the deck of a ship, her hand brushing against a railing slick with mist, and beside her, a figure in a coat and gloves moving silently forward. In the morning, the fog had begun to thin. Sunlight pressed weakly through, and the garden reappeared in pieces. First the gate, then the rosemary bushes, then the low stone wall. On the mantel, the glove sat as she'd left it, but the red thread was gone, replaced by a thin length of white rope tied in a small perfect loop. She touched it lightly, feeling the weave under her fingers, and thought of how many knots and loops a sailor might tie in a lifetime, each one a sign, each one carrying a meaning known only to those who understood the code. And as we leave her here, imagine the fog still lingering at the edges of the house, the glove and rope resting on the mantel, and somewhere in that soft grey distance the quiet sound of footsteps fading into the sea. The white rope stayed on the mantel for 3 days before she found its meaning. Each morning she would glance at it while pouring her tea, the loop perfectly neat, the fibres pale against the darker wood. It had the feel of something waiting, like a note left unspoken. On the 4th day she decided to walk the garden. The fog was gone now and the air had turned sharper, the kind of clear that makes colours feel more alive. The rosemary brushed her skirt as she passed, its scent quick and green. Near the gate she stopped. There, tied to one of the posts, was another length of white rope, this one forming the same perfect loop as the one on her mantel. She bent to touch it, and the knot was so firm it seemed to have been there for years, though she was certain it hadn't been the day before. The rope trailed downward, disappearing beneath the gate into the lane beyond. She opened the latch, the metal cool in her hand, and followed the line as it stretched along the hedge. Every few yards, another loop appeared tied neatly to a branch or post, leading her like a trail marker. It ended at the cliff path, where the rope looped around a low rock before dropping down toward the shore. She stood there a moment, the sea below glinting in the pale afternoon light, and thought of the red thread on the map, the lantern in the hall, the key to the lockbox. She didn't climb down that day. Instead, she followed the rope back to the house, coiling the loose sections in her hand as she went. The loops were all tied with the same precision, each one identical, as though made by a practiced hand. That evening she set the coiled rope on the mantel beside the glove. "I've seen your path, Elias," she said quietly. The lantern gave its soft glow in reply, steady and sure. Later, as she sat by the fire, she felt a shift in the air. Not colder, not warmer, just denser, as if the space between her and the far corner of the room had drawn closer. She kept her eyes on her stitching, letting the moment pass without breaking it. That night she dreamed again of the ship, but this time she was not on deck. She stood below, in a cabin, lit by a swinging lantern, the rope coiled neatly on a shelf, the sound of water pressing against the hull. She could hear footsteps overhead, steady and measured, and the faint hum of a voice carrying through the boards. When she woke, the coiled rope on the mantel was tied differently. The loop had been undone and retied into a figure-8 knot, the same one she remembered from the first length of rope he had left her months ago. She traced it with her fingertips, wondering if it was an answer or an instruction. By midday, the thought had settled. She would follow the rope's path to the shore on the next low tide. Not to wander, but to see what lay waiting where the line ended. And as we leave her for now, picture the mantel in the late light, rope coiled in its new knot, the glove resting beside it, the lantern's glow steady, and outside the faint call of gulls circling somewhere beyond the cliff. The tide chart promised a low ebb just after dawn. She rose early, pulling on her boots and a heavier shawl, for the morning air still held a bite despite the season. The garden was quiet as she passed through, dew silvering the leaves. At the gate she paused where the white rope had first been tied. There was no rope now, only the faint imprint where it had pressed against the wood, but she remembered the path well enough. She followed it along the hedge, past the gorse and brambles, until the cliff path opened before her. The descent was easier this time. The ground was dry, and she knew where the stones would hold and where they might shift underfoot. The air grew heavier with the scent of salt as she neared the bottom. The shore was wide and pale in the morning light, the tide well out, leaving a scatter of seaweed and shells. She made her way toward the rock where the rope had ended, scanning the sand as she went. That's when she saw it. A mark in the sand drawn with a careful hand. It was a circle, and inside it a figure-8 knot rendered in smooth, precise lines. The tide had not yet reached it. The edges were still sharp. In the centre of the knot was something small and metallic. She knelt and brushed away the sand to reveal another coin. Silver, like the one from the lockbox, but less worn. The engraving was different. A single anchor crossed by a key. She turned it in her palm, the metal cool, the weight familiar. For a moment she thought she felt the faintest vibration, like the hum of a ship's timbers under sail. She looked toward the horizon, half expecting to see a lantern's glow even in daylight. There was nothing but the slow rise of the tide. She slipped the coin into her pocket and stood, letting the wind press against her shawl. The mark in the sand looked deliberate, like a message. But whether it was meant to be read or simply found, she couldn't yet tell. By the time she climbed back to the house, the sun was higher, spilling gold into the parlour. She set the coin on the mantel beside the first, the two side by side like companions. "I found it," she said into the stillness. The lantern glowed once, just a flicker, but enough. That afternoon, she sat by the window with her sewing, the coin glinting faintly across the room. The rhythm of the needle matched the sound of the sea below, and every so often she felt the strange certainty that someone was pacing in the hall, just beyond her sight. When night fell, she dreamed of the mark in the sand again, only now it was carved into the deck of the ship itself. The knot seemed to shift under her gaze, its loops turning like the currents of water until the centre opened like a hatch. She woke before she could see what lay beneath. And as we leave her here, picture the mantle with its growing collection. 2 coins now, their silver catching the firelight. The rope's figure-8 knot beside them, and in the air the faint scent of the sea rolling in through the night. The 2 coins sat together on the mantle for a week before she noticed the difference between them clearly. It wasn't just the designs. One with the twin anchors flanking a crest, the other with the single anchor crossed by a key. It was the way they seemed to catch the light. The first coin gleamed most in the lantern's pale glow, the second in the warmer light of the fire. She tried placing them apart, then side by side again. Each time, she felt as though she were arranging a pair of bookends, 2 halves of a story meant to stand together. One evening, she took both coins to the table and set them on the unfolded map. The first she placed near the X marked off the coast. The second she set inland near where a house would be. They looked almost like markers in a game, though she knew the stakes here were deeper than play. The lantern flickered then, just once, as if acknowledging her arrangement. The compass needle on the mantel shifted too, not much, but enough for her to notice. It pointed not true north, but slightly toward the place where the inland coin rested on the map. That night she left rum beside the coins instead of on the mantel. In the morning the glass was empty and the coins had been swapped, the anchor and key now at the coast, the crest and anchors inland. She smiled faintly at that, as if she'd lost a round of some game she didn't yet know the rules to. The next day was warm and still, the kind of weather that makes the sea look deceptively calm. She walked the cliff path again, stopping to watch the sunlight ripple on the water. She thought of the 2 coins, of how each seemed to belong in both places, and wondered if they were meant to represent journeys, departures and returns. That night she dreamed of the marionetta once more. The deck was empty, but for the 2 coins lying side by side on a coil of rope. The sky above was a deep indigo, the stars sharp and bright. A hand, gloved, familiar, picked up one coin and held it out to her. When she reached for it, the dream shifted, and she was standing alone in the parlour, the coin warm in her palm. When she woke, the coins were exactly as she had left them on the mantel, but the glove was now resting between them, its fingers curled slightly inward, as if it had just set them down. She didn't move it. Instead, she left both coins and glove together, the lantern glowing faintly beside them. There was no rush to solve the meaning. Whatever it was unfolding at the pace of tides, not clocks. That afternoon, as she was dusting the sideboard, she found another small bundle wrapped in oilcloth tucked beneath the ledger. Inside was a scrap of paper, brittle with age, bearing just 3 words in Elias's neat hand, 2 anchors hold. She placed it with the rest on the mantel, where it seemed to settle naturally between the coins. The words didn't answer anything, not exactly, but they rooted the mystery more firmly in her mind. And as we leave her here tonight, picture the mantel as it stands, the 2 coins gleaming in different lights, the glove resting between them, the paper's message small but steady, and the lantern's pale glow holding it all in a quiet watch. She couldn't stop turning the words over in her mind. two anchors hold. They sounded less like a riddle and more like a principle, the kind a sailor might mutter to himself in foul weather. Yet she felt sure they were meant for her, not as a piece of seamanship, but as a direction. The coins stayed where she'd left them, the gloves still between, but she began to imagine the places they might represent. One anchor inland, the other in the sea. And if anchors held, then perhaps the place between them was what mattered most. On the map, that midpoint lay just above the cliff shore, neither entirely on land nor fully in the water. She thought of the tide pools there, the way they held their own small worlds between the pull of the ocean and the weight of the land. The next afternoon, she took the path down, timing it so the tide was halfway out. The air was warm and bright, and the rock pools shone like bits of glass scattered along the sand. She stepped carefully among them, skirts gathered, scanning for anything out of place. It was in the largest pool, ringed by dark rock, that she saw it, a length of rope, white as the one from her garden, coiled neatly beneath the water. At its centre lay a small tin box, its surface mottled with salt and rust. She knelt, reaching in. The water was cold enough to sting her fingers, but she lifted the box easily. It wasn't heavy. The rope came with it, still looped in that same perfect figure eight. She didn't open the box until she was back in the parlour. The tin creaked faintly as she eased the lid, and inside she found another piece of parchment, folded and surprisingly intact despite its time in the water. On it, written in Elias's hand, was a single line. Between the anchors, the current steadies. She read it twice, then set it beside the earlier note on the mantel. The rope she coiled neatly next to the glove, the tin she placed under the map, as though the paper's message belonged there. That evening she left tea and rum both. The tea was gone within the hour. The rum lingered as if whoever had come for it had stayed to watch her read. Later, as the fire burned low, she felt that now familiar shift in the air, a presence moving from the hallway toward the mantel. She didn't look up from her chair, but she smiled faintly when the lantern began to glow. That night her dream was of calm water. The ship lay still, both anchors down, the deck lit by two lanterns swaying gently. She stood at the bow, the current quiet beneath her, and though she could not see Elias, she felt the steady weight of him nearby. When she woke, the glove had moved, now resting lightly atop the two coins, fingers spread as though to keep them in place. She left it there, feeling the message was not yet complete, but closer. And as we leave her now, imagine the mantle lit in the lantern's glow. Two coins, the glove, the rope, and the two notes side by side, each piece holding as firmly as the anchors in her dreams. The phrase wouldn't leave her. Between the anchors, the current steadies. It was as though the words themselves were a tide, pulling her towards some centre she had yet to reach. For 2 days she stayed close to the house, watching the sea from her window. It was calm now, the waves folding themselves neatly along the shore. She traced the map more than once, fingers moving between the two coin markers, as if she might feel the answer under the paper. On the third morning, she decided to go back to the shore at half-tide, when the water would be neither rushing in nor fleeing out. The walk down was quiet. No gulls, no wind, only the low, constant hush of the sea. She stepped into the shallows where the sand was firm and smooth, the water barely covering her boots. The line between land and sea was clear here. The tide balanced in its middle moment. She stood still, listening. It began as a faint hum, so low she thought it might be the sound of her own breath in her ears. But it deepened, resolving into the steady creak and sway she knew from her dreams, the sound of a ship holding against the current. She closed her eyes, and the air seemed to change. The damp saltiness thickened, carrying the faint scents of tobacco, cedar and rope. She thought she felt warmth at her back, not like the sun, but like someone standing close enough to block the breeze. When she opened her eyes, the water in front of her shifted. For a moment it seemed to dip, revealing a darker shape beneath. Nothing sharp or clear, just the shadow of something long and solid lying deep. She took one step closer, the cool water rising to her ankles. The hum grew stronger, pulsing with the same rhythm as her own heartbeat. She didn't speak. It felt as though speaking would break the balance. The moment lasted only a few breaths before the tide began to turn, the current growing restless again. She stepped back toward the sand, the hum fading until only the sound of the waves remained. By the time she returned home, the lantern on the mantel was already glowing. The glove had moved again, its fingers now pointing toward the map, straight at the red X off the coast. Between the coins, the notes lay side by side, their words catching the flicker of the fire. She understood now. The place between the anchors wasn't just a location, it was a moment, a point in the tide when both the sea and whatever lay beneath it were in perfect balance. That night, she left a cup of tea, a glass of rum, and a sprig of rosemary from her garden. In the morning all three were gone, and in their place was a small smooth stone carved with the faint outline of a ship's bow. She placed it between the coins and thought for the first time that perhaps the story was drawing toward its own steady harbour. And as we leave her here tonight, picture that mantle, coins gleaming, rope coiled, glove resting near the map, and the carved stone at the very centre, holding everything in quiet place, just as the current had held her there in the shallows. She felt the change before she could name it. The air in the house seemed thicker, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, the weather had turned still, not the soft stillness of summer evenings, but a kind that felt poised, waiting. For 2 days she moved through the rooms with the sense that she was not alone even in daylight. The faint creak of the hallway floor came more often, the lantern's glow lasting longer into the night. Once, while dusting the mantel, she was sure she heard the slow rustle of a coat sleeve just behind her. It was on the third afternoon that she decided to prepare. She didn't know for what exactly, but she knew the feeling of a tide about to turn. She began with the mantel, dusting each object carefully, the coins, the glove, the rope, the shells, the compass, the carved stone. She polished the lantern's glass until the cracks caught the light in tiny rainbows. Next, she took the map from the wall and spread it on the table. The red X glared brighter than she remembered, the ink almost fresh-looking. She traced the line to the shore, and then, without thinking, marked a small circle where the midpoint between anchors would be. From the cupboard, she brought out the tea service, polishing each cup and plate. She set them on the low table beside her chair, placing the rum glass in the centre. The lockbox she left open, its contents laid out neatly beside it, as though ready to be inspected. By evening the sky had taken on a heavy tint, the horizon blurred where the sea met the air. She lit the fire early, the warmth creeping into the room. As the first shadows gathered, the lantern on the mantel began to glow. This time, it didn't glow alone. From the hallway came a second, smaller light, warm and golden. It moved slowly toward the parlour, pausing just at the doorway before drifting in. She didn't rise, only watched as the two lights came together over the mantel, their glow mingling in a soft halo. There was no sound but the fire, yet she felt the air shift, as if someone had stepped closer to her chair. She kept her hands folded in her lap, steady. "If this is the night," she said quietly, "I am ready." The lights lingered a while longer, then began to fade. Not out into the hallway, but upward, as though drawn toward the ceiling. The glow dimmed until only the pale shape of the cracked lantern remained. When she went to bed, she left everything as it was. The mantel was set, the map marked, the coins side by side, the carved stone between them. In her dream, she stood once more in the shallows, the current steady at her ankles, and from the horizon a ship approached, its lanterns lit, swaying gently in the dark. And as we leave her here, imagine that mantle glowing faintly in the night, each object in its place like pieces of a compass, all pointing towards whatever was coming with the next tide. It came on a night when the moon was just a thin sliver, its light barely enough to silver the tops of the waves. The wind had fallen away entirely, and the air outside felt dense, as though the sea were holding it close. She had left the parlour ready, the mantle arranged, the map on the table, the fire burning low but steady. The lantern was already glowing when she sat down, its cracked glass casting soft patterns against the wall. She felt the change almost immediately, not a sudden shift, but a gathering, like the slow pull before a wave breaks. Somewhere beyond the window came a faint sound, oars dipping into water, steady, deliberate. She closed her eyes and listened. The rhythm was slow, the kind of pace meant for arrival rather than escape. When she opened her eyes again, the second lantern light was there, moving toward her from the hallway. It paused beside the mantel, and in that moment the first pale glow swelled brighter, as though in greeting. The coins gleamed. The compass needle quivered once, then settled, pointing not north but toward the sea. The glove shifted slightly, its fingers curling inward, and then she heard it. A single step on the wooden floor. Not the creak of the house settling, but the deliberate weight of a boot. Another step followed, then another, until the air seemed to thicken around her. She didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the mantel, letting the moment arrive in its own time. The scent of cedar and salt was strong now, and beneath it, the faint tobacco warmth she had come to know. The final step brought him beside her. She could feel it, the nearness, the shape of a presence filling the space just to her right. For a long moment they stayed like that, the firelight and lantern glow mingling across the room. When she finally turned her head, she saw enough to know. The coat collar high against the throat, the shadow of a jaw, the glint of brass buttons. His gaze met hers, not sharp but steady, the way one might look at a familiar shore after long weeks at sea. No words passed between them, yet she felt the message as clearly as if it had been spoken. The tide is here. They stood in that quiet until the fire burned down to embers. Then, as the lantern's light began to fade, so did the shape beside her, dissolving into the air as gently as it had come. The coins lay exactly where they had been, but the carved stone had shifted, now pointing directly toward the X on the map. She banked the fire and left the room as it was, the faint smell of the sea lingering behind her. In her dreams, the ship's lanterns burned bright against the horizon, and the water was calm, holding steady between its two anchors. And as we leave her here, imagine that sliver of moon hanging over the quiet sea, the tide at its highest, and the house still warm with the memory of footsteps on the floor. She woke to a stillness so complete it felt as though the world were holding its breath. The gulls were quiet, the usual creak of the roof beams absent. Only the faint sound of the sea remained, low and even, like a slow heartbeat under everything. The parlour was exactly as she had left it, the coins side by side, the glove resting between, the compass pointing seaward. But the carved stone was gone. In its place lay a slip of parchment, edges curled from damp. She recognized the handwriting immediately. When the tide steadies again, follow it. The ink was dark, fresh, as though written only hours before. She sat in her chair and read the line over several times. It was not an invitation to wait forever, nor a command to act immediately. It was something between, just like the place between the anchors. The rest of the day she spent as though the house were a ship preparing for a voyage. She mended a shawl she might wear against the wind, polished the lantern until the cracks in its glass gleamed, even took the time to oil the hinges of the front door so it would open without complaint. That evening she carried the old rope from the mantel and coiled it neatly into a satchel with the glove, the 2 coins, and the compass. She left the map where it was, folded to show the red X. When darkness came, the lantern glowed once, faintly, but no second light appeared. She took it as a sign that the tide she was waiting for had not yet come. Instead of disappointment, she felt an odd, quiet contentment, as though being given time to prepare was its own kind of gift. She dreamed that night of walking along the shore, the sand firm beneath her feet. The sea was calm and a figure walked just ahead, his steps leaving no mark. Each time she drew closer, the tide whispered over the prints and they vanished. In the morning, the parchment on the mantel was gone. Where it had been, she found a length of red thread tied in a sailor's knot. She wound it carefully around the compass, letting it hold there like a reminder. For the next 3 days, she kept to her routine, but always with an ear for the sound of the tide at balance. And each night she checked the shoreline from the cliff path, waiting for something, though she could not have said exactly what. And as we leave her here, picture that satchel by the chair, its contents ready, the compass waiting under its coil of red thread, and the sea beyond the cliff breathing in its long, patient rhythm. It was just before dawn when she woke to the sound. Not the rush of waves, not the crash of breakers, but that rare, balanced hush. When the sea pauses between its comings and goings, she knew it at once. The tide had steadied. The parlour. The satchel waited by her chair, the coins and compass inside, the rope coiled neatly. She rose without lighting the lamp. The pale light of early morning was enough to guide her to the glove resting on top. She lifted it, feeling its weight, and stepped into her boots. The air outside was cool, the grass silver with dew. She followed the cliff path without hurry. There was no need to rush a moment that had already arrived. At the edge, she looked down to the wide stretch of shore below, the water lying calm and level against it. The descent was steady, her boots sure on the dry stone. She crossed the sand to where the shallows began, the water lapping gently at her feet. The current was neither pulling nor pushing, only holding, as if waiting for her to step into its centre. She waded out until the water reached her knees. The hum began then, deep and low, like the sound of timbers shifting under sail. The scent of cedar and tobacco wrapped around her, warm even in the cool morning air. And then she saw it. Not a full shape, but the suggestion of one. The curve of a hull beneath the water, the glint of lantern light where no lantern could be. From the shadowed deck, a figure stood watching her, steady as the tide itself. She reached into the satchel, drawing out the coins. One she held in each hand, the metal warm from her touch. She let them fall into the water, where they sank slowly, the ripples spreading in perfect circles. The figure lifted a hand, gloved, familiar, and the faintest nod passed between them. The current stirred once, then steadied again, the hum deepening until it was part of her own heartbeat. When she stepped back onto the sand, the shore felt changed, not in its shape, but in its weight, as though something had been set right. The water behind her held still for a long moment before beginning its quiet retreat. She climbed the path home with the satchel lighter now. On the mantel the lantern was glowing, though she had left it unlit. The compass lay where she'd set it days ago, the red thread still knotted tight. She sat in her chair, letting the fire warm her. Outside the tide was already turning, the balance past. But in her chest the steadiness remained, as though the anchors still held somewhere deep beneath her. That night she dreamed not of waiting, but of sailing. Her hands on the worn wood of the rail, the sea stretching calm ahead, the lantern swaying gently above her. And beside her, the faint brush of a coat sleeve against her arm. And as we leave her here, picture the parlour quiet, the tide moving again beyond the cliff, and the memory of that still moment between anchors settled deep enough to last through every change of water yet to come. Underscore 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 underscore. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. If you drifted off somewhere along the way, let me know below. Sweet dreams. Until next time.